We are excited to have you all here. Welcome to January 2026 Technical Assistance Live, TA Live. We are joined with Alliete Alfano and Daniela Reyes. Did I say that right? Reyes?
Yes, it's okay.
Reyes. Ah, man, so close. And I'm so excited to have them here. They are such fun, amazing human beings, and you are going to have just so much fun listening to them. In the chat for me, please put your name, your district, and your role, and then your 2026 word if you have one. If not, that's also okay. And we will get started. I'm going to hand it over to these lovely ladies. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. All right, so welcome to our presentation, Supporting Multi and Bilingual Deaf and Hard of Hearing Students. Can we go to the next slide, please, Daniela?
Of course.
Thank you. So I'm Alliete Alfano. These are my disclosures. I work at FIU. I own a private practice. I've made some test adaptations. So these are my disclosures. Daniela?
And I'm Daniela Berrios Reyes. My disclosure is I'm a full-time employee of Advanced Bionics, the cochlear implant company. The learner outcomes that we are going to discuss today, the first is identify best practices when working with bilingual children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Identify ongoing informal assessment tools for bilingual children who are DHH, and discuss strategies for parent coaching of bilingual children who are DHH.
So we wanted to real quick cover a couple of definitions just to get them out there. So we know that bilingualism is common, especially in Florida, and it is on the rise in many parts of the world. And many of parts of the world have people being bilingual, multilingual. And so the question is, how do we work with these kids in our schools, right? There's a few things to kind of break apart when we're looking at bilingualism. So really the definition for us is the ability to use two languages in everyday life, two or more languages. And you can be a simultaneous bilingual child or a second language learner or sequential bilingual. And so children who are learning two or more languages from birth or more or less around the same time would be considered simultaneous bilingual children. What we do need to remember with these kids that seldomly are they exposed to each of the languages equally. So it's very rare for a child to have a teacher or a parent say, this is blue, and then turn around and say the exact same thing in the other language. So we see that exposure can be a little bit different. Second language learners or sequential learners would be children who begin to add an additional language after they have one language that is firmly established. So normally that happens after age 3 or so. Another word to consider is code mixing, and this really is using the features of both language in the same utterance or stretch of conversation. So this mix could be phonological or the sounds of words. It could be the actual vocabulary or the words. It could also be the morphosyntactic changes like word endings or word order, or it could be a pragmatic change, changing between the two languages. Most children who are bilingual use code mixing, and this is a very typical thing that happens, and we need to understand that there are individual differences in how children code mix as well as how adults, and that we should be expecting this. And it could also look different with different people that they speak with, right? So there could be people who speak a lot of their home language and very little of the majority language, so might do a little bit of code switching into English, and it could be the other way around, right? So we know that it's going to sound different in different ways. All right, so in the next slide, I also want to talk about this one word because you've seen this probably at the end of our title. So listening and spoken language specialists really are professionals who are committed to providing quality services to families who want their DHH child to listen through the use of their devices to speak. So certified listening specialists have achieved the highest professional standard in their field, and this process includes mentoring from somebody who's already gone through this and has a lot of experience, additional continuing education, and then also a certification exam. All right, next slide. And so we want to show you this continuum, something to consider when we're talking about communication for individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. Regardless of if they have one language or multiple languages in their environment, we need to consider that there are multiple approaches available for them. And you can see on this continuum that really it moves from like mostly auditory approaches to mostly visual approaches. So this long continuum. What's most important when you're looking at this slide is not that there are different options, but that the method that you choose is not actually as important as choosing one of those methods and implementing that as early as possible to get language and communication going. I know that sometimes there's questions about, if you should only sign, if you should only be oral, what happens if you mix them? Something to consider. Both Daniela and I are native in English and in Spanish. We are conversational in ASL. We are also LSL or LISL specialists. And so we are able to support children across several approaches. Not every professional has the ability to tackle all of these approaches. Some people have more specialty than others. So something to consider depending on what the family wants to use with their child to find the professionals that will really help them get there. So Daniela and I like to consider ourselves kind of like unicorns in the field. But this presentation really, what we're covering is going to apply for any of these communication approaches, whether we're talking about two visual languages, two auditory languages, or any combination therein.
So moving into statistics. So why does all of this matter to us? Well, because statistically it should. According to the US Census Bureau, approximately 29.8% of households in our state of Florida reported a non-English language at home as their primary shared language. So this figure is significantly higher than the national average of 21.5%. In 2021, the most commonly spoken non-English language in Florida households was Spanish. About 22.1% of households reported speaking Spanish at home, which reflects the state's strong Hispanic and Latino presence and cultural influence. So some updated statistics up to 2022 is that it actually increased to 30.8% of Florida households reported speaking a language other than English at home. The percentage stayed at 22.1%, indicating Spanish being their primary language. So these figures indicate that Florida's linguistic diversity is notably higher than the national average, where approximately 21.5% of households speak a non-English language at home. And this is why it should matter to all providers in Florida, and probably why so many of you have joined us here today. So let's kick off the discussion by busting some common myths. Alliete glossed over the answer to this myth in the definition section, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper. So bilingual children will become confused. Parents who raise their children bilingually or think about raising them bilingually are often concerned that children exposed to parents who use both languages will become confused, that they will be unable to separate the two languages. And this is based on the assumption that the brain is monolingual, right? And therefore the brain cannot separate the two languages, or that children will mix them up when they talk, indicating that they are confused. And the reality of the matter is that the brain is born ready to learn the languages of its environment without confusion or delay. And as a matter of fact, children as early as infancy can discriminate languages. And by 4 months of age, they can discriminate languages that are rhythmically similar, which is wild, right? But children as early as 1 to 2 word communicators exhibit differentiated use of those two languages dependent upon communication partners. And additionally, children can learn new languages at any age. So the myth is busted. They will not become confused. Language milestones of bilingual children are typically met on par with those of their monolingual peers. The development of language milestones and the proficiency of specific language is dependent not only on the amount of exposure, but also the quality of exposure. So that's something you'll hear us talk about a lot today, is not only amount of exposure, but quality, right? So what is the quality of a parent who's demonstrating language in maybe their second language, or who's only putting their child to observe based on what they're watching on TV, for example. So quantity and quality both make a difference. Grammatical constraints indicate that code mixing is not a sign of confusion, and parents should interpret this as a strength. So as Alliete mentioned, code mixing is a normal part of bilingual language development, and bilingual children actually have good reasons to code mix. So when I was reflecting on this statement, I was like, what do we mean by grammatical constraints? And what that means is that a bilingual speaker knows which parts of the language can be inserted in another, and they avoid combinations that would violate the grammar of either language. So the mixing happens in a predictable, systematic way that linguists can study and describe, and ultimately demonstrates that it's a strength and a natural part of bilingual language development rather than a problem or a delay. The next myth is that children with disabilities, like hearing loss, should not be exposed to more than one language, as it will confuse or further delay them. And I still get this question today, even though there's so much literature out there, mainly from parents who have this concern. But literature confirms there is no question that children with disabilities, including hearing loss, autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, and so on, they are able to learn 2 or more spoken languages to the degree to which they have the capacity to learn one language, okay? So I wanna make that very, very clear. Can children who are deaf and hard of hearing become bilingual? Yes, they can. Will bilingualism lead to delays in children who are DHH? I hope at this point it's clear the answer is no. So let's move into assessment. Key points in bilingual or multilingual assessment. So first and foremost, we want to assess all the languages in the child's life using both standardized assessments and dynamic assessments, just like we would do for children who are bilingual with typical hearing. We know that assessment tools normed on typically developing users of standard American English may not sufficiently capture both the strengths and the needs of children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Culturally relevant assessment is critically important. So if you measure a bilingual using a monolingual measure, you are more likely to find false evidence of delay. Bilingual children with language impairments will present with patterns of language impairments in both languages, and likely standardized assessments will help give us kind of a baseline of where they're functioning, which will need to be interpreted with caution because the norming group is not typically representative of all bilingual children. So often you can't qualify a child for services without some kind of standardized testing, right? That's, we all know, but we do need to look at both languages and incorporate dynamic assessment. Dynamic assessment could be a presentation in of itself, but the biggest takeaway is looking at what the child can do. So what is the child's capacity to learn a particular skill and respond to intervention? So I'll give you an example. You want to pretest, assess the child's current performance, teach using mediated language experience, help that child develop strategies, observe that child's modifiability, and then post-test. So compare their performance to the pretest and assess that transfer of strategies. So use of criterion reference tests, portfolio assessments, narrative assessments, and ethnographic assessments are additional approaches to obtain reliable data in the absence of norm reference testing for a learner from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. So following that, right, we have big shoes to fill here. We also want to analyze and understand with reference to the different environments in which that child learns and uses language. So taking a total vocabulary versus conceptual vocabulary into consideration. Total vocabulary is the sum of the words a child knows across 2 languages. Conceptual vocabulary gives the child credit for knowing concepts rather than words, and concepts that are represented in both languages are only counted once. So a measure of total vocabulary provides the best indicator of young bilingual children's language learning capacity. Simultaneous bilingual children are often found to have smaller vocabularies than monolingual when each language is considered separately, but equivalent or even larger when both languages are considered together. So ultimately, differences as well as similarities in bilinguals and monolinguals are to be expected throughout the assessment process. And fortunately, researchers and clinicians like Alliete are now developing bilingual specific measures that paint a more accurate picture of bilinguals' global language competence.
All right, so what is our task? We need to make sure that we have the differentiation of what is expected speech and language errors that result from native language influences onto the majority language, and separate that from errors that are actually indicative of a speech and language disorder that might be secondary to hearing loss or specific speech or language impairment. And this isn't very easy to do. It requires a lot of different testing and making sure that we know what would be expected, what looks typical, and what does not. Also, it can be difficult because many native language influences can look like signs of speech and language disorders, but they're typical. One example with children who are deaf and hard of hearing is a child who appears to not comprehend oral multi-step commands. What could be the reason why they don't understand this multi-step command? Well, there could be a variety of things. First, maybe the child isn't aided well with his hearing device. So maybe the device is faulty, a cable is loose, they need a fresh battery. Here's another option. Maybe the child needs a new device programming, so their programming is not up to date. Here's a third option. If the child has comprehension difficulties, they might have comprehension difficulties outside of these issues with their devices. So it's a comprehension issue across languages in their brain. Or number 4, maybe the child and the language that you're using with that child, the child is lacking sufficient language skills in that language to understand the commands. So really, it's not fair to ask them those things in a language that they don't have full dominance in. And so if that child could follow those steps in their other language, right, we would need to know what's happening in that language. So here's 4 ideas of things that might be the issue, and we need to disentangle all of this. So we need not to get caught up in the thought that if a child doesn't behave like a monolingual, that must be indicative of a disorder. But also, we need to not assume that all differences that we see are typical, because then we might miss some of the red flags that are actually leading us to a possibility of a true speech or language disorder being present. So there's a lot of fine tuning and special attention that you need to take when you're looking at these kids. A bilingual with a language disorder will likely demonstrate some error patterns that a monolingual with that same disorder would demonstrate. Typically, bilinguals go through the same or similar speech and language milestones as monolinguals of the same language. But also we need to remember that there are a couple of things that bilinguals do that monolinguals don't do, right? Like that code switching we were talking about, and finding these cross-linguistic influences from one language to the other. A good reference for some of the differences that you would expect is written at the bottom of this slide. It's a book called Bilinguistics. It is by Bilinguistics, and the book is called Difference or Disorder. We're going to be sending out these slides to you later, and a lot of these links, or most of these links, will actually take you to where you need to go. All right. So we're going to look at some assessment information here. When you're talking about assessment with children who are deaf and hard of hearing, it's pretty typical for assessment with children who have typical hearing, right? So we look at oral motor function, articulation, language, pragmatics. Really, the main difference here is being able to assess the area of speech perception. I know, you know, that it's not culturally appropriate practice to simply translate an English test item into another language like Spanish or ASL. A salient example is the importance of cultural adaptation, would include knowing things like some words are acceptable in one Spanish-speaking country, but an obscenity in a different Spanish-speaking country. But I even want to make a bigger point on the dangers of simple translations in the area of speech perception. It's important to understand that specific speech perception tasks are no longer relevant if the words are simply translated into a different language. So, for example, if the task at hand was to identify between a one-syllable and a two-syllable word in English, like dog versus rooster, right? This would violate that task if you just change it into Spanish, because dog, one syllable, becomes perro, two syllables, versus rooster, which is two syllables in English, is gallo, also two syllables in Spanish. So this would not be a very good task to do just by simply translating. Similar violations would take place if the task was to identify between two minimal pair words, right? If you start changing and you don't know how many syllables it might be in the other language, this point is rather moot. So one big distinction between bilinguals and bilinguals who are deaf and hard of hearing is also to consider their hearing age. So this is knowing that you want to know how old their hearing is, right? So how long have they had their devices on and be programmed well to be hearing and speaking? So this is something we definitely want to keep in mind there. All right, next slide. Here is an example of some assessments that we typically use for language. This is for most speech pathologists, and some teachers of the deaf also use these. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but just to give you an example of what they are, we have tests on this slide or language evaluations. We have English on one side and Spanish on the other. You see they're on the same line if they're the same test, but just available in both languages. And so some of these tests, like the SELF-P and the SELF-5 and the OWLS, are like global language tests, where other things are like questionnaires for parents, like the Rossetti and the Real, and some are one-word vocabulary tests, like the receptive and expressive one-word picture vocabulary tests, so the ROW and the EOW. So these are some of the types of tests that we use. On the next slide, we'll actually see some evaluations that were developed specifically for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. As you can see, some of these have an example of what they have available in Spanish, and some don't have an alternative in Spanish. Something also to consider is that most of these tests, if they're available in Spanish, that might be the only language you find, because it's really hard to find tests in some of these other languages as well, other than Spanish. The open and closed set task is for assessing a toddler's ability to imitate and understand spoken language during the first 2 years of implant use. The cottage acquisition scales for listening, language, and speech monitor skills from pre-verbal to complex language structures. The tags is a series of 3 rating forms that are developed to evaluate a child's understanding and use grammatical structures of English. The tassel is designed to assist teachers when analyzing and assessing syntax, and they provide suggestions for focusing on the development of language. All right, so let's move to the next slide. Here you see some of the speech tests that we typically use. We have on the left some tests that are specific for speech, but not specific to DHH kids. The ones in the middle are specific for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, and the ones on the right are for Spanish speakers, but not specifically for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. The CID speech skills rating form is an easy to use form. It's criterion referenced, and the assessment is really designed for professionals who are working with kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. It assesses voice, suprasegmental aspects of speech, vowels, consonants, blends, and clusters. So if you're an FLP, you might be using some of these. If you're a teacher of the deaf, you might be looking at some of these, or you might be reading about some of these in the assessment reports that you get from your speech pathologist. All right, and on the next slide, we have some of our speech perception assessments. All of these are specific to children who are deaf and hard of hearing, because remember what we talked about in assessment, this is the one area that is really different that we use when we have kids who are deaf and hard of hearing versus kids who are hearing. So All these tests vary in skill from basic auditory functions, like asking through parent questionnaire, all the way through a full test battery like the APTI, where the child has to answer questions that go from speech detection through discrimination, through identification, and then all the way up to comprehension. All right, and so now we're looking at some ongoing informal assessments that teachers of the deaf and SLPs should be doing. These can start from as easy as daily listening checks. I'm not sure how often you've used these. If you've seen them, maybe you're well versed in them. I'm actually going to show you an example, and then we'll have a link that will take you there. So Daniela, if I can share real quick. Hopefully my computer wants to cooperate. And I will. All right. Are you seeing it? Yes. Okay. So here's an example of Ling 10. Maybe you've heard of Ling 6, where we have 6 basic sounds. The Ling 10 really gets a little bit further into all the areas that a child can hear these speech sounds. And so in this Ling test, you have, depending on the child's level, you either want them to detect the sound or to identify the sound and tell you back the sound. This can look different. For example, with a young child, you can have them just turn when they hear the sound that you make, and we know that they've heard it. And it can go also, for example, to a listen and drop. I don't know if you've heard this before, but it would be something that we like to practice so that when our kids go to the audiologist, they have this skill already in hand where they listen to something, they hold an object to their hand, and then they drop it in a bucket when they've heard it. And so we practice this in a variety of ways so that they're more prepared to go into the audiological booth. And so we want to ask them these sounds at the beginning of every session. So we ask them without lip reading, right? So this is something where they're looking at this page with just listening and dropping. E, right? And so when we say and the child repeats back the sound or listens and drops, we know that they've heard that sound. I will send you a link to this form, and it will really explain better how to do it step by step so that you know. So this should be done every day, really as soon as the devices are put on. So in the morning, after a nap, after a bath, at the start of any listening session. It's a simple thing to do. And once your child knows how to do it, it takes about 10 seconds to be done. All right. Let me go back to, I'm going to show you one more here. All right. So we want to talk about language samples. I think that I would imagine many teachers have heard of this before. I know that SLPs in the group have, but I think sometimes it breaks them out into cold sweats because they don't want to do it. Because it seems like a more daunting task, more complicated than it needs to be. But it's really important. So this is what we call a language sample and deciding what the mean length of utterance is. So we want to know how long the sentences are. And this is something that teachers and SLPs should be doing at least every 3 to 6 months. So for example, what you do in a language sample is you play with a child, you read some wordless picture books with them, you chat about toys, movies, TV shows that they like, and you go collecting their sentences, right? What they're saying. You want to make sure that you're recording this because it's really hard to remember what kids are saying and to get it down correctly, right? Because sometimes you see daddy go work, they said this, but in your mind, you automatically wrote daddy went to work because your brain just fixed that, right? But we want to write exactly what the child said. So what we want to do is collect that sample. You want at least 100 to 200 utterances. But for sake of brevity, I'm showing you 10. And so once you do that, you want to transcribe the sample as accurately as possible so you can see each of the utterances that they wrote here. And then you want to break it down by morpheme. So I would be one morpheme. Want is another morpheme. That's 2 so far. And cookie would be another morpheme. That's 3 for that sentence, right? That's 3 for that sentence. Daddy, go work. Daddy is 1. Go is another 1. Work is another 1. That's 3 utterances, 3 morphemes for this sentence, so on and so forth. So as we go through this, we count them all up and we end up with 34. At this point, you're going to do your simple math. You take the 34 morphemes and you divide it by the 10 utterances that you have. If you had 100 utterances, right, you might have 60 morphemes or what have you. And then you calculate this number here. And then in the links that we have, you'll be able to identify if the child had, for example, a 3.4 MLU, as you saw here, you would know that that is typical, right, of a 3 to 3.5-year-old. Now, the question is your child 6? We know that they're delayed. If they're around 3.5 years old, they're right on target. So that's one thing, another thing that you should be doing. All right. So Daniela, I'm going to let you go ahead and start sharing again.
Perfect. Is it up good? Well,
hold on. Take me back to the slide before, please.
Oh.
All right. So we had.
There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so we talked about the listening check, we talked about language samples, and then the others are the ones that you've seen on some of the previous slides that are assessments that were made for teachers. All right, thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to move from assessment into strategies for working with children who are bilingual, who are also DHH, and this goes into intervention. So when we're referring to intervention, we want to support all languages that the child is exposed to the best of our ability. If you're unable to support those additional languages that the child is exposed to, there are options. You can incorporate the parents, depending on the setting that you're working in. It may be easier or more challenging, incorporating an interpreter, incorporating another adult or family member from the community, like someone from their church who might speak the 2 languages if it's a less common language, a family member, or refer the family to someone locally who can serve those language needs. So it might look like incorporating the older sibling that is bilingual and coaching that person in English so that they can do the exact same thing in their primary language. So your goal should be to support any languages that exist in that child's environment. Researchers in the literature suggest that providers should encourage and foster dual language development for children with hearing loss who use cochlear implants or hearing aids. So there are many factors that have an influence on the acquisition and proficiency of developing a second oral language. Factors such as the absence of an additional disability, although, as we've discussed, the literature does indicate that children with disabilities can learn additional languages to the capacity that they can learn languages in general. Parental involvement can impact second language acquisition or additional language acquisition. Amount of exposure to the second language. Educational settings have also been shown to have a large impact on the success of second oral language acquisition and proficiency. Parental involvement and desires for their child to become bilingual are significant factors. So parents should be coached on ways to model language techniques at home in their native language. Discouraging families from using their native language reduces that child's exposure to their language, and it also can impact the family dynamic. So parents should allow their children the opportunity to experience meaningful language opportunities in their home language. Another important factor in the acquisition and proficiency of a second oral language is the amount of intervention and therapy. The children in many of the studies that we reviewed received intensive auditory oral or auditory verbal therapy, which is believed to have contributed to their language skills. The children in the studies did not have any other known disabilities aside from their hearing loss, and other factors that had an impact were the age of implantation, the length of device use, and just general access to sound. So most of the children in those studies who were successful were implanted before 2 years of age, which had beneficial results on their language development.
All right, so let's talk about the AEIOUs of developing multilingual proficiency. You've heard some of this already. We keep talking about it, and it's important to keep hearing it. The first, the A of this AEIOU is the access to sounds of the language. So this would be for oral languages. It is important for children to hear all the sounds of those languages so that they can learn to detect, discriminate, and identify those sounds, and then later understand what those words mean, right? For children learning two languages, where one language has sounds that aren't present in the other language, being able to hear those differences and then discriminate them is extremely important. For the E is for exposure to fluent language models. This is true in oral languages as well as sign languages, right? Children who are learning to use a language usually do it by signing or speaking with the people that are around them. If the family member uses that language in a natural manner, in regular phrasing, the sentences, the expressions, then the child will learn to use them in the same manner. So this can happen when the speaker is comfortable and fluent in the language. If the speaker is not fluent or uncomfortable, what they say may not be as complete or complex or diverse as it could be. And this is really important to consider if we suggest to parents to speak English only with their children if they are not strong English speakers. They're not speaking with the best model that they can. And we should consider that their home language or their sign languages might be a better option for them. The I is for interaction in meaningful contexts. And this is really about how children learn words, phrases, and sentences using them in a meaningful way. So for example, they might learn how the names of foods are or how to use food items in the home when they're doing a daily routine like eating or getting ready to serve food. And that would make it so much more meaningful and really how they learn better. The O is for the opportunity to use the language. A child or adults too really are going to learn new languages when it has social value, right? So you need the opportunity to learn it. I've been learning an additional language on Duolingo. I have not been speaking it. I'm not doing very well. I need to find friends that speak this other language that I'm learning. Really, we want to know, like, what do I get from this language? And we need to be able to use that socially. And finally, the U is for you. You valuing the language that you're learning. Really, you reinforcing and celebrating the child's language learning will encourage that child to learn more, speak more, share more. As professionals, it's really important that we help families see the progress that their child is making and that the progress they are helping their child make is really important because families and caregivers need to experience that they, like, the more they put into this process, the more they're going to get out.
So we're going to go into a topic that I enjoy talking about, which is cultural dimensions. So beyond the differences that we can physically see, cultural diversity includes different ways of thinking, living, and communicating. Cultural dimensions refer to a framework developed to analyze and understand the differences and similarities in cultural values, norms, and behaviors across societies and regions of the world. They are categories that assist in understanding the inner workings of any given culture. They include all aspects of life, ranging from child rearing practices, family dynamics, education, employment, and healthcare practices. So cultural dimensions provide a structured way for us as clinicians to navigate the complexities of interactions with individuals from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So I'm not going to read the definitions of each of these just for time's purposes. You'll have access to them, but I will talk about how you might experience it with a patient that you're working with. So individualism versus collectivism might look like someone from a collectivist society or culture might want the extended family to be included in appointments and participate in healthcare decisions. Clinicians for power distance may find that a family's ability to self-advocate in moments of disagreement or confusion can be challenging, right? Power distance may impact an individual's comfort level in being coached or participating in therapy or simply asking questions. So as you are interacting with individuals from culturally and linguistically diverse cultures, take into consideration how they might perceive being thrown into participating in joint planning for therapy or into advocating for themselves in a cochlear implant journey, for example, asking questions of a surgeon, for example. Uncertainty avoidance may impact the way a client responds to evaluation results or the uncertainty in a prognosis or outcomes. Clients with high uncertainty avoidance, they might require more clear, systematic, and structured direction, while a low uncertainty avoidance culture may be more tolerant of ambiguity and chaos. So it can impact the way a parent perceives their relationship with their child, specifically with masculine versus femininity or more feminine cultures. Some of the cultures are more focused on equality or obedience. And that can impact their interactions, especially if we're doing play-based therapy, for example. Masculine and feminine cultures can impact an individual's perceptions of the responsibilities of scheduling appointments, providing payments, asking questions. Some cultures have very strict views, values, or restrictions on interactions between opposing genders, which can directly impact assessment and intervention when working with CLD populations as well, or culturally and linguistically diverse populations. There are some cultures where a male-female interaction is frowned upon, right? And that can impact someone's response to an evaluation, for example, and give you a false indication that they may have a communication deficit. Long-term versus short-term orientation may impact a family's desire to hide a disability or to respond promptly to a diagnosis or a therapeutic recommendation. And this is a big one, especially when we know that early intervention can make such a significant difference. And so kind of taking a step back and realizing that with this population, there are cultural influences that play a factor here. Indulgence versus restraint. Families with high indulgence may have an easier time participating in playful therapy interactions, while those who may have been raised in a restraint valued culture may have a more challenging time. High context versus low context communication kind of impacts their perception of time or verbal communication styles, such as turn-taking expectations, amount of talking among conversational partners, greeting rituals. There are other things such as nonverbal communication, attitudes toward conflict, etc. So monochronic versus polychronic time relates to how cultures perceive and manage time. So it's important to recognize that these dimensions don't encompass the full complexity and diversity within any culture, but any effort that a clinician makes to connect with the family from a diverse background, whether it's through learning a few words in their language, incorporating a cultural holiday into a therapy plan, approaching a conversation from a culturally responsive lens, can impact the therapeutic dynamic. So we mentioned earlier that both Alliete and I are listening and spoken language specialists. A lot of these strategies or techniques to promote listening and spoken language lend themselves well to just promoting a language-rich environment in general, which include technique number one, for example, continuing full-time use of hearing devices during all waking hours. Technique number two, creating a good listening environment. Number three, creating a language-rich environment, as many of you may be familiar with. Technique number 8, vary the types of talk using naming and labeling, self-talk and parallel talk. Technique 11 is probably my favorite, which is creating an expectation to use language with that child, right? So that the parent understands that there is an expectation for that child to utilize language. Technique number 13, utilizing acoustic highlighting and setting expectations for communication. Parents should use whatever strategy promotes high quality and high quantity exposure to each of their child's languages. This is also a question I get asked a lot when I'm working with families who are culturally and linguistically diverse, is how can I avoid this being more difficult for them, right? So promoting balanced exposure and positive interactions will ensure that both languages are fully acquired. So it is up to the family to decide what works best for them. Some families, like mine, one parent, one language approach where I, as the mom, talk to my son in Spanish and my husband talks to my son in English. And that works for us, right? Sometimes we utilize other strategies as well. Minority language at home, where they're utilizing their primary language at home and the secondary language, if primary is Spanish, that's being used at home, secondary is used out in the community. Time and place, some parents like to get very strategic, right? So they might choose, we're going to use Spanish at breakfast and we're going to use English during bath time, right? And we're creating a language-rich environment. And again, this might work best for some families, and some families like, I don't want that much rigidity in my life. So just giving them the option and the information allows them to make a decision that works best for them. And then natural mixing of languages is just kind of also happens in my household, where we just fluidly mix between the two. So strategies to motivating caregivers to participate in therapy. Invite the caregiver in for a collaborative discussion. Determine the caregiver's goals for that child. Do you want your child to be bilingual, or do you just want to focus on one language? Do you want your child to use oral language or manual language, or both? Having that understanding is also going to allow you as the clinician to adequately support them. Provide parent education on language strategies. Your parents should know what language strategies are the most efficient and what language strategies they should be practicing at home, right? It should be a very meta-aware process for them. Provide the parent with resources catered to their learning style. So this might seem a little odd, but it's actually one of my favorite questions. How do you want me to share resources? Do you like videos? Do you want me to print out a document for you, a summary? Do you want a book about it? And parents are often like, oh my gosh, actually, that's great. I would love a video. Or I never watch videos. Can you give me a printout? I'll read it at the next appointment, right? And they're more likely to actually look at the material you're sharing with them. Invite the caregiver to participate in a natural play activity or interaction in a supportive and judgment-free environment. This allows me as the clinician to observe their interaction and maybe find ways where we can enhance it and better enrich the interaction. And oftentimes that looks like, hey, I would love to see what your favorite activity from home or your favorite toy is. Can you bring it in and let's play with it next time? And kind of let them take the lead and take observations and then, talk with them about, hey, I noticed A, B, and C. Why don't we try to use this language strategy to enhance this interaction? Demonstrate effort in understanding and caring about their culture and their language goals. So this can be achieved through motivational interviewing or ethnographic interview. Given that all of you are professionals who are facilitating communication, you have to have an understanding of that client's daily life, perception of communication, and their perception of their child's disability. So an ethnography is used to study and learn about the social life of a group of interest. An ethnographic interview is a collaborative effort between the provider and the person being interviewed. So during an ethnographic interview or case history, there's an opportunity to understand the family's language usage, structure, support system, among other things. So many of types of questions can be used, like descriptive questions that encourage the interviewee to share their experiences, their customs, their values, and their worldviews. An ethnographic interview can also assist you as the clinician in understanding the reason for immigration. That can give you a lot of information about their village, their support system, or some of their worldviews. Trauma can also express itself through reduced language output or decreased desire for interaction, which can kind of come through some of these children we're working with if we're just getting them when they first arrive. And that can having that information can be helpful to better serve that child. So if there is any indication of potential trauma, clinicians should research trauma-informed practices relative to culturally and linguistically diverse populations. That could also be a presentation in of itself, but there are resources out there that allow you to better support them. So the information learned during an ethnographic interview can increase your understanding of their viewpoints, their needs, and their preferences. You can create your own ethnographic interview based on information that you have, but I have some examples here. Tell me about a typical day for you and your child. right? This will also help me understand how much time they are actually spending with their child. We might think that they see them every day, and then we learn that they don't. What kind of things have you learned about the diagnosis or communication challenges you're experiencing? Will give you a better understanding of how maybe they perceive the position that they're in with their diagnosis. Tell me about your support system. Some additional questions: what social or religious events are important to you and your family? How are these communication deficits impacting the participation in these events? Some families like to have big dinners every evening. What goals are you hoping to accomplish in therapy, right? Because they need to have buy-in if they're participating. Give me some examples of what you and your child enjoy doing together, and share with me some challenging times during your daily routine. So I would say these are questions that I used with almost every family, and it allowed us to establish stronger rapport. I found that families are more willing to carry over things that we're working on in therapy into the home, and that can facilitate an improvement in language outcomes as well. Strategies to incorporating caregivers in therapy. So identify the strengths and needs of the child, as well as the strengths and needs of the interaction between the child and the parent or the caregiver to support language goals. Invite the parent to bring a preferred item, like I mentioned before, and inviting the parent to participate in choosing goals for themselves. Like, here are the list of the language strategies that we typically use. Which one do you feel like you really don't have an understanding on, or that you would like to improve upon? And they're more likely to try to work on it if they chose it themselves. Incorporate the caregiver into planning and executing a session. If there is an upcoming holiday, hey, tell me about the holiday. How do you guys celebrate it? What could we do in therapy to kind of help them learn the vocabulary of that holiday? Create an in-between session goal. So oftentimes I'll be like, okay, we worked on A, B, and C today. What would you like to work on between now and when I see you next week? Coach the caregiver on strategies using I do, we do, you do, meaning I do it first, then we do it together, and then you do it independently. And then utilizing reflective questioning. How do you think that went? What were the pain points? What do you think would have made it a better interaction? Strategies if you don't use the language. Incorporate a member of the community, as I mentioned earlier. Use telephone coaching. So if we have the aunt who's bilingual with the mom, share with the aunt what the instructions are, who can then share it with the mom and with the child. Involve an interpreter if you have those resources. Refer to someone in the community who is fluent, especially if it's something that is not as common of a language. Prep them ahead of time. Review what you're going to do if you are working with an interpreter, and review vocabulary that you are going to work on. Review parameters if you're working with kind of an intermediary, especially if you're doing an assessment. You don't want them to invalidate it. Coach on when they're allowed to give hints or extra support and when they're not. Avoid using the phrase, tell them that I said, right? Because that's just a waste. So we're using telephone coaching and we're moving in a fluid dynamic as a team. And look directly at the family when you're speaking to them if you're using an interpreter. Strategies when working with translators and interpreters continued. Oh, this seems like a dual, but you got it. Empowering parents to have positive language interactions through collaboration. So remember that our goal is to facilitate positive interactions in a language-rich, natural environment when we're working with bilingual children who are DHH and their caregivers. Our goal is not to correct their interactions, but to enhance them. So we want to collaborate with them and make it as successful as possible. If you're working with trilingual families, bring in the support, bring in additional professionals. I had recently a meeting with a family who the child was utilizing ASL, the mom was primarily Spanish speaking, and the sister was primarily English speaking. So it was a really interesting dynamic, but we got it done. We utilized additional professionals to make sure that all of the language needs were met, and everybody was able to participate. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And with that, we will open the floor for questions, if we have any. That was a lot of information in a very quick time frame.
I know y'all got through it all though. It was so good. This is the second time I've sat in on this presentation and I'm just I love it so much. So good. So so good. And I mentioned in the chat how a lot of the assessments that you guys talked about we have on our assessment tools page and I got from this presentation. And I was like, Elliette, can I
Yay!
use some of these? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, great. And then I had Lynn look over some of Lynn Mishkel from Debbie's school look over some of them too. So we collaborated all with all of our friends to make sure we have a robust, assessment, available assessments on
Nice.
our listed as well for everyone. So I don't see any questions in the chat. If y'all want, I know we have 5 minutes left. If you wanted to share any
The resource
resources,
page? Yeah.
yeah, that next, so that people can scan that if they want to.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think on the last slide at the end, so after people look at this, they can take down our emails if they want to ask us questions later. We're
Beautiful.
happy to connect that way as well.
Awesome. And I threw the resources in the chat for everyone as well. So
Yes, saw those. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for having us.
yes, thank y'all
Yes, thank
so
you.
much. I'm gonna take over sharing just real fast so that I can get the evaluation QR codes and all that jazz up for everybody. So, all right. Again, Alliete, Daniela, thank y'all so much for joining us today, for sharing your expertise. Y'all are some just amazing human beings and also amazing professionals. And I appreciate you both so much for being here and chatting with us today. Next month, we have Jennifer Francisco from the Educational Interpreter Project, EIP, on working with an interpreter and in the classroom. So join us next month. That is February 11th, again at 2 o'clock. And then all of our services that we do are provided for free because we are an IDEA funded state project through the Department of Education, Florida Department of Education. So if you could scan this QR code or get the link in the chat for your evaluation, and we read every single evaluation. We encourage your feedback. We want it, we need it, and it shows how our work is necessary and how we can improve our work to help better support all of you. So please complete the evaluation for us. And after you've completed the evaluation, after you've done that, then you can also then scan the QR code or get the link in the chat for your certificate of completion. And whatever you type in is what is going to show up on your certificate. So make sure your name is spelled correctly, your email is correct, and then for the title, supporting, so it's CLI, supporting multilingual students who are DHH. So sorry. All right. Thank y'all so much. Let me check the chat one more time, make sure I don't see any
No, I
questions.
don't
I
think so.
don't.
We were very
Awesome.
thorough, so no questions.
I think so. It was very comprehensive, so thorough. Your emails were provided, so I'm sure if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can ask. Thank you both so much for being here. We appreciate you, and I hope to see you face to face soon. And
Yes,
so glad to see your faces. And thank y'all. Thank everyone for being here, and Happy New Year. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Terry, to our interpreter. Thank you so much.